You might have heard last week that recording from the Sydney Writers' Festival on the author's right to speak we broadcast. That was English writer Monica Ali, who spoke about the freedom of expression in the wake of the 1989 Iranian fatwa against Salman Rushdie and the publication of his book, The Satanic Verses. Today we'll hear from Australian playwright David Williamson and his thoughts on writing about women. David Williamson has written scores of plays, including Don's Party, The Removalists, The Club and Emerald City. He says the writer's task is a form of truth-telling, and that means both male and female writers should be able to depict socially sensitive or depressed women, if the storyline calls for it. And he says that doesn't mean women are being stereotyped. Here's David Williamson speaking at last month's Sydney Writers' Festival.
In the early 80s, I went to a writers' conference in New Zealand. At it, a male writer revealed a guideline document on the writing of drama issued to writers working for the New Zealand Broadcasting Commission or Corporation, I'm not sure, NZBC. It contained a list of 20 ways that writers should avoid depicting women. I can't remember all 20, but some are still etched on my male mind. They included the strong suggestions that women shouldn't be shown in a domestic situation, cooking or caring for children, or being financially or emotionally dependent on males. Writers should avoid depicting women as sympathetic, emotionally sensitive, gentle, affectionate, dependent, nurturing. And their screen occupation should avoid personal assistants, teachers, nurses, and other traditional female occupations. Screen depictions should avoid the suggestion that they are more preoccupied about their appearance than men, or more interested in discussing personal relationships. Shots of female legs in stockings or shots beginning with a woman's bottom in close-up as she walks away from the camera were a no-no. Women should not necessarily and preferably not be beautiful or pretty, and depicting them as sex objects was at the top of the list of sins. Suggestions that women were more intuitive or more skilled at reading people's feelings were also to be avoided, along with a whole lot more. Stereotyping of women in fiction was said to have led to the present awful plight of women in society, and it was, according to New Zealand cultural gatekeepers, to stop forthwith. The beleaguered male writers looked at each other, wondering what was left for them to write. Ugly, foul-mouthed, insensitive car mechanics with volcanic tempers. At the core of such requests is the notions that we're all socially constructed, and therefore the way we depict women will in fact socially construct them. Fiction, in this sense, will become reality. The writer's task was to construct them in a new and more progressive way. Writers were seen as social engineers in the same way that Soviet writers were given the task of creating Soviet man. The opposite way of looking at writing is that it's a form of truth-telling. The writer observes and reports truthfully without shaping their writing to social ends. It is true that some writing can't reach the truth because the preconceived stereotypes in the writer's mind prevent the truth being reached. This, in fact, was the central message of postmodern literary theory. And in this sense, alerting male writers to simplistic female stereotyping has benefited their search for the reality they wish to depict, and in this sense has been helpful and productive. But when prescriptive ideology attempts to prevent the telling of truths is when writers, including female writers, should get a little edgy. The truth is that there are some average male-female differences, and they are well documented and backed by strong research evidence. Just a couple of examples. But first, it's necessary to say, and this is based on a paper summarising huge numbers of sex difference studies by Peter Anderson of the San Diego University Department of Psychology. His overall conclusion was that the research on sex differences has led indisputably to the fact that men and women are far more similar than different. But there are differences. And this is not of the populist women are from Venus, men are from Mars type rubbish, but he lists them. I'll just pick out a couple, just for an example. This is from the British Journal of Psychiatry, volume 157. Based on 538 subjects, females are 4 times as likely to suffer recurrent unipolar depression as men. Females also exhibit more anxiety and are more likely to have been admitted to hospital than men. These differences could be explained by the higher prevalence of depressive temperament in women as measured on self-reporting temperament scales. Well, that's a hypothesis. A second area, women on average are more engaged, sensitive and skilled communicators than men. Vast number of studies show this to be true. Women are better coders and decoders of non-verbal and emotional signals and have generally superior verbal skills. And these differences are not trivial. They average half a standard deviation, which in statistical terms is very large. It's the difference between someone being 5'8" and 6 foot. And here's the important part. These differences are too geographically, historically and developmentally pervasive to be primarily a function of social learning. In other words, these differences are universal across culture and time. As distinct from postmodernist theory, we're not just socially constructed. The evidence is now overwhelming that we're biologically constructed as well. And all the social engineering in the world is not going to make males, on average, better decoders of emotional signals than women, or males to suffer more recurrent unipolar depression. Since the 80s, the gatekeepers might hesitate to commit such prescriptive anti-sexist guidelines to paper as the New Zealand Broadcasting Commission did then. But they're still out there in the ether, and the most common and pervasive form of censorship is self-censorship. Writers should be able to depict socially sensitive or depressed women. Not all the time, because the sex differences are only average differences, but the depiction of such traits shouldn't be necessarily condemned as stereotyping. Sharpening male writers' skills and helping them to get closer to reality by pointing out gross stereotypes is beneficial, but attempting to dictate that they modify their observations to fit an ideological imperative is quite another. Thanks very much.
Australian playwright David Williamson speaking at the Sydney Writers' Festival there on the author's right to speak, and will be bringing you the thoughts of novelist Richard Flanagan and Neil James, the Executive Director of the Plain English Foundation, in coming programs.